You are listening to Ask An Asexual. This is part of the Ask Us series, a short-run podcast dedicated to breaking myths and stereotypes by asking real people. I'm Sheena, and I'm joined today by author and podcaster Heather Rose Jones and author Alex Woods. Thank you both for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
So today we are talking about what asexuality is and is not. So Heather, let's start with you. What is the difference between being asexual and aromantic?
Well, the first thing to understand is that both of those are a spectrum. So it's a wide variety of experiences. And what I came up with, and this is my own personal way of explaining it, it's not like somebody's official definition, but asexuality is experiencing sexual arousal, that is physical arousal, to a more limited degree or in a more limited set of circumstances than our society considers to be typical.
Okay.
And aromanticism, very much in parallel with that, is then experiencing romantic attraction, that is the emotional response, to a more limited degree or in a more limited set of circumstances than our society considers to be typical. So there's a whole range of what people feel. There's a whole range of how people interact with those feelings. And there's a lot of different individual names that people have for different versions of it. But if you think about it as there's a spectrum, and way over at one end, there's a thing that society calls, quote unquote, normal. And the rest of it is the range of experiences that people put a label on and say, well, that's not normal. That's asexual. That's aromantic.
Okay. Well, let's start by killing the word normal, because I find it's a terrible word, because there's no normal assumes that everything else is abnormal. So let's use the word perhaps common, which I think is a better term. It's something that's commonly known.
Much better
right?
definition.
Okay. So now I'm still a little unclear on the difference between asexuality and aromanticism, right? So is it kind of the same thing?
No.
It's
No.
not. Okay. All right, good. So explain explain to me then.
Okay, you look at an asexual person. An asexual person, it's not that you abstinence, it's not that you maybe don't want to have a romantic relationship, and it's not that you just don't want to date other people. An asexual person can be everything from a person who likes to have sex, a person who likes to maybe just have the romantic aspect of a relationship, but just don't have the want to have a sexual relationship with the person that you are in a romantic relationship. There are a lot of gray zones. There are a lot of aspects in asexuality that are so huge that even today we don't really know who falls under this umbrella. A romantic person is a person who does not actively seeks the urge to be in a romantic relationship. Like, I know a guy, he has lived alone for over 50 years. He doesn't want to date a gender. He doesn't want to have to deal with buying flowers, go to a restaurant, have someone in the evening to sit beside and watch a movie or hold hands. That is a romantic person, a person who has friendships, but nothing more.
Okay, so I think I get it. So asexual has to do with a sexual relationship, whereas an aromantic has to do with a romantic relationship. Is that more or less right?
If you want a really convenient shorthand for it, asexuality has to do with your physiological response. And aromanticism has to do with your emotional, your mental response.
So can you be asexual and aromantic?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Cool.
And you can be asexual and aromantic and have a wonderfully rich social life and have lots of friends and have warm relationships with everybody in your life.
You just don't want to drag somebody home in the end of the evening and have to cook dinner for.
I see, okay. So here's one of the common myths, is that asexuals don't exist. So I think it's allosexual, right? The people who have what's considered the common sexual
experience. Yes.
That.
Yes.
Okay. So allosexuals can't quite wrap their heads around asexuals, and so there's this myth that asexuals don't exist. Alex, I think this was you that brought this up.
Sadly, until this age, and people believe that everybody has to have a sexual drive or wants to get people laid all the time, and that it's a medical thing, that something is not right with your hormones or with your brain, that people think that asexuality is just not right because you're a human and a human has to have the urge to make more humans. I mean, if I only look to myself, I have a lot of medical problems and I see a lot of doctors. And the last time I saw an endocrinologist, he asked me about this and I said no. It's like, no, I'm not the type of person. And when we got deeper into it, because we had to talk about it, he said, well, if we put you on this and this medical stuff, then you maybe get your drive back. And I was like, I never had one to begin with, so no, thank you. From a professor.
The analogy I have is a religious one. So it's like trying to explain to somebody who is sincerely and deeply religious that you are an atheist. And from their point of view, it's atheism isn't a thing because, of course, God exists. And so there is either, accepting God or rejecting God, but they can't wrap their brain around the idea of there not being a God. So having a conversation with a sincerely religious person about atheism is very much the same as having a conversation with an allosexual about asexuality. They don't quite grasp the reality in which it's possible. So it's like, they'll ask you, it's like, well, but how could you manage to be a good and moral person if you aren't worried about what God thinks about you? And you just sort of throw up your hands and you say, well, I do. I've got other analogies.
I know the feeling.
So, how old were you guys when you came to the realization that you were, asexual and aromantic, for me at least, has been terms that only relatively recently has come into kind of a global awareness. So did you go seek communities? Did you what was that journey like for you?
Horrible. Because first of all, I had to grab the concept that I was different than the other boys and girls in my class, because I didn't feel the way the other ones did. I didn't do the stuff the other ones did around me. Then to really realize, okay, I'm gay, I get it now, but not to be able to talk about it because of the surroundings I was in. So first I had to grab my head around this concept, who I was, accept who I was. And then I got thrown in this big LGBTQ life in a city where I had my education at the university. That was in the early 2000s, and you had to play this sort of role because you had to go on dates, you had to have someone to spend the evening with. And I tried at some points to point out, like, I don't really have this big interest. I'm not interested in one night stands. I'm not interested to make out with this girl. And they just said, well, you have to do it because you're a lesbian and you're young. You're supposed to have these experiences. So I tried to play the role. I was not happy. I was never happy with it. When I was in my first long-term relationship, in my early 20s, I was really satisfied because I didn't have to play this big role anymore. I didn't have to be out and date all the time, but still I was in the asexual closet because I had to play this role that I had to be interested in a very active sexual relationship in my romantic relationship. And I didn't dare to say no because I was afraid she would leave me. After I got my serious illness and my last ex broke up with me in a horrible way, I decided that I'm not going to play this role for anyone anymore.
So, Alex, at what point did you realize that? Was it like an aha moment, or was it a slow thing that you realized you were asexual?
It was rather slow because I was never happy with this hypersexualized things that was shown in the media. When that came up, like when the L word came out and more movies were shown, the people I hung out with in the LGBTQ group I was in, it was like we have to be this way. We can't be and behave in another way because it was like they wanted us to behave in this special way. And I never felt comfortable with it. I never did, and I still don't. It was really like in my mid-20s when I really realized, okay, I'm different than the others, and I started to make some research on the internet. And that was really my my big haven, because in the early 2000s, when internet and media on the internet wasn't like it was today, you couldn't find anything on asexuality because nobody knew what it is and nobody talked about it.
It's still a dark and mysterious thing, whereas being something like even transgender, which was also something that was kind of dark and mysterious at one point, not that long ago, even that's getting a lot more coverage than asexuality or aromanticism or anything like that. This is still an area that is completely unexplored in mainstream media. So how do you even know?
Well, it's hard. My story is I came out as a lesbian when I was in college back in the later 70s. I came out as asexual about 5 years ago in my mid-50s.
Oh, wow.
And people are complicated. People are not ever just one thing. And in my case, there are a bunch of, confounding factors, as they say in science, where it's like, I'm shy. I am a serious introvert. I am geeky and intellectual and have some unusual hobbies. I have a physically negative response to crowded, noisy spaces. That kind of goes along with being an introvert. And I've always felt kind of out of sync with how the majority of people socialize. It's like I'm speaking a different language. I'm missing the cues. They're saying things, but they're not in words, and I'm not hearing them. And I'm saying things that I don't realize I'm saying. And there's just, miscommunication. And I've been like that ever since I was a little kid, in terms of socializing in general. So, coming out as a lesbian was about thinking about myself being with a woman, and then thinking about myself being with a man, and realizing that there was absolutely no comparison between the two visions. And so I came out when I had had one date with a woman, but I'd figured out that felt right. That felt like what I was looking for. So there I was in my 20s and 30s, making stabs at relationships, and they would always go something like this. It's like, so we'd go on a couple dates, we'd, hang out together. She would start expressing an interest in having sex. I would not really be feeling it, but either I'd go along with it, and then I would start feeling really claustrophobic and anxious, or I'd say, look, I'm not feeling ready for it, and she'd break up with me. And it felt to some extent like some of the same problems I had with making friendships, where I really feel like I need a long time of getting to know people before I feel that connection and that trust. I have my best friends are people that literally we would bury bodies for each other. But it takes, it can take a decade to build that up for me. And if I meet somebody at a social venue and I say, hey, you're a really cool person, I'd really like to get to know you better, I have a really hard time figuring out how to move it from that initial feeling of, hey, this is a person I'd like to be friends with, to actually figuring out how I build up that history of interactions to feel like we are friends. I'm currently kind of doing that with somebody I met on Twitter that happens to be a almost near neighbor of mine, where it's like, I would love to be friends with this person, and I'm not entirely sure how one goes about that. And so relationships were like that too, where it's like, hey, I'm attracted to this person. We have a fun time together. We get along. I'd like to spend more time with this person. I could envision myself spending the rest of my life with this person, but I'm not sure how to get from here to there without going through sex. And one of the big problems was that, hanging out in lesbian spaces, and this was like especially in the late 70s, the 80s, and so forth, not only was it a very sexualized space, there was, a lot of sexual innuendo, a lot of, assuming, the old joke about, what do you bring to the second date, a U-Haul trailer. And the other thing was that there wasn't that framework of other interests to build up a relationship where I would then feel comfortable, because my interests were just different. It's like, people always say, hey, if you want to meet your life partner, go out, join clubs, do activities, do fun things, and then, you'll meet somebody. I met a lot of people, but very, very few of them were lesbians. And I think I dated all of them. So it wasn't until I was in a situation where I was long-term dating someone where, for geographic reasons, we are not spending a lot of time in each other's pockets, that I had a chance to build up that sense of trust and the non-sexual parts of the relationship to a point where I could sort out and, remove the layer that is, the sexual component and say, okay, so separate from feeling anxious, feeling shy, feeling like I don't know this person enough to trust them yet, entirely separate from that, there's also this other thing I'm not feeling. And that's why it took me until I was in my 50s.
Okay. I can see that. Especially if you don't have anything to go by. You don't know, it's not till now that we're starting to get asexuality in literature, and we don't see it at all in any other kinds of media. So there's no connection. I actually can't even wrap my head around how.
Well, we do see asexuality in other types of media. It's just used as a sign of villainy and evil.
Yeah, and very, very badly portrayed. Very badly. That they are these odd people who nobody wants to have anything to do with, and that they are the outsiders and weird and hide bodies in their basement.
And probably psychopaths.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so Heather, I have a question, and feel free to tell me to bugger off if it's too personal, but once you've developed your long-term relationship with someone, do sexual feelings ever develop for you or not at all?
I don't know yet.
So you've never gotten to that point in the relationship where you can go, or okay, maybe.
So this is starting to get, touch around, things that I choose not to talk about, because I kind of made a commitment to my current partner, and partner is a bit, too committed a word. We are long-term dating, and I'm not going to talk about the specifics of our relationship because that belongs to her. She has not consented to be part of this.
That's fine.
So what I can say is that, back when I was dating in my 20s and 30s, I kind of gave up in my 40s, but, I always had the assumption that if I could just tough my way through it, if I could just, go along with the flow and build up that relationship, and eventually it would work the way it was supposed to work. And it never did. I never felt anything different.
Okay.
I don't know whether I might. I will toss in, there is a physiological aspect to this. It's like, I am well past menopause at this point, and people's sexual responses do change. with changes in hormone levels. I will say, in terms of my private sexual activity, let's call it that my activities have changed and my frequency has changed. And so I don't know to what extent that is a part of it. I met the woman I'm currently dating after we were both past menopause, very well past. Maybe I just missed that boat entirely. Maybe if I met somebody in my 20s and, I would have eventually gotten through to a place where I was feeling, sexual arousal. I don't know.
Here's some listener questions. Does asexual mean not having any sexual feelings, or does it mean not having sexual feelings towards another person? So I think here that this, whoever came up with this question is confusing it with, I think there's a kind of sexuality where you feel sexually aroused by inanimate objects or non-human beings.
But that's part of the spectrum. That's in the definition I gave, saying, to a more limited degree or in more limited circumstances. Because watching erotic movies, it's like allosexual people can get aroused by watching erotic movies. Some asexual people get aroused watching erotic movies. Not all. It's incredibly variable and individual.
And there are asexual people who have sex. But the difference is that asexual people, like if you are in a long-term relationship or your partner or you have married, there are aces who have sex because it can either be because just of the feeling, because if it's from both sides, okay, it feels good, or it can be because it's an act of love and that you just want to be with your partner or please your partner. But the difference is that either the ace person doesn't need to have the feeling to have it all the time, or the difference is that the ace person just can't get aroused by the person, but by the thinking of the sexual act.
All right, so what I'm learning so far is that it's really complicated and not at all as simple as like one mold fits all.
Absolutely.
Okay. The next listener question is, how can asexuals know that he or she is homosexual or straight if there's no sex drive or sexual attraction?
Because love and sex are different.
Exactly. It's all about who you crush on, who your feelings are towards. So it's exactly the same like in the beginning when I said to have to figure out if I'm straight, if I'm gay, if I'm trans, what am I?
Absolutely. Okay. And the last listener question is, were you born asexual? I assume the answer to this is yes, but discovery came later because you didn't necessarily have all the information.
I will answer that by saying I am not utterly convinced that anybody is born anything. And part of this comes out of, Sheena, as you know, I do a lot of research into the history of sexuality. And so much of our understanding of our own sexualities is shaped by the models we have and the understanding of the world that's presented to us and how we fit ourselves into that. And I am not, I dislike the whole born that way thing because it removes agency. It removes the way we interact with our society and our understanding of the world. And people are born with certain types of predispositions. And what I was talking about with my general social reaction to the world, where, the whole bit about being shy and not liking crowds and noises and taking a long time to get to know people, even for friendships. Yeah, that's part of my innate personality. But was that a switch that meant that, yes, I'm in the asexual category and it's fixed from birth? I mean, simply look at the fact that it took me so long to identify myself as asexual. If the tree falls in the forest, does it know it's asexual? If there's nobody there to desire it. I don't know where I was going with that. But, if I did not have a social model for asexuality being a concept, would I be asexual? If I didn't have a social model for homosexuality being a concept, would I be a lesbian? In centuries, when our modern ideas of heterosexuality and homosexuality did not exist as such, can we identify those people as being gay or lesbian or straight? So I think it's a question that has a lot of embedded assumptions, and I'll circle back to, I think people are born with certain predispositions, but they are not born into categories.
And then there's the all other thing that it's a spectrum, and a spectrum can shift. That I know people who in the past have identified themselves as asexual and are today in the more sexual spectrum, and then after a while they go back to the asexual spectrum.
Absolutely. I've spoken to women who say that they started off more bisexual, and as they grew older, they leaned more towards lesbianism, vice versa. I think you're right. As times change, our lives change, whatever it is, we also change. Why not?
And the very word spectrum, when you think about it in terms of light, and I'll be geeky and linguisticy at you right now. The fact that we chop up the visual spectrum into categories that we call with particular color names, that's a social interaction with the physical world. And the way that we identify groupings of behaviors and experiences and call them by particular names, that's a human interaction with the physical world. And in the same way, the choice of where we draw the lines, is turquoise green or is it blue? Is burgundy red or is it purple? That's a human social decision, and it doesn't have objective reality. But the wavelength that we're trying to put in a category, that has objective reality. And in the same way, people's emotional and physical experiences have objective reality. But how we define the categories that they fit into, that's human subjectivity.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on.
You knew what you were getting with me.
I did. I can't even begin, because I thought very briefly there, maybe I'll just end off with a short end on that, and I was like, nope, I'm good. There's no, I'm not even going to try. That was, but well said though. But very complex concepts. My poor brain. You have been listening to Ask An Asexual. I'm Sheena, and I was joined today by Heather Rose Jones and Alex Woods. Check out the show notes to links about things discussed in this episode. If you enjoy this podcast, then come and talk to us on the Lesbian Talk Show chat group on Facebook. You can email us on podcast@thelesbiantalkshow.com or follow us on Twitter @lesbiantalkshow. You can also join our community of patrons and get exclusive content. Go to patreon.com/thelesbiantalkshow. The link is in the show notes. Find this and other exciting podcasts. All you need to do is search for The Lesbian Talk Show anywhere that you listen to podcasts.